What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Ernie, Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Okay, so in today's video, we are going to be talking about a character that I feel like no one ever really talks about when they talk about characters from Milestone Media's comics, Dakotaverse. No one ever talks about this character, and you always have people tell me that, oh, the Milestone Media comics, they were okay, but they were just too black, they were too brown, they were too colorful, they were too ethnic. They didn't have any characters that were, just your average garden variety, bog standard white person. And you know what? I often have to correct people and say, no, you are in fact incorrect. There were multiple white characters in the Milestone Media Dakotaverse. And in this video, we're going to answer the question, who is Deathwish of Milestone Media and DC Comics? And we're going to talk about that right now. But first, let's hit that intro.
Word to wise, grass only greener when it's fertilized. Gave them truth in these songs, they prefer to lies. Destiny beautiful, adrift in her purple lies. You can't see me, you Stevie, wondering how I reach more evolutions than Evie and make it look easy.
Before we get started, if you want to see more awesome comic book videos like this one, it only takes 2 clicks to become one of Earth's mightiest subscribers. Click. Okay, so Deathwish, a character whose real name is Wilt Johnson, first appeared in Hardware number 5 in 1993 and was created by Dwayne McDuffie and Dennis Cohen. Deathwish has probably one of the most messed up origins I've probably ever seen in a comic in all my 33 years of reading comics. Wilt Johnson was your average schmuck, a guy just trying to make it in the world, and apparently he was even willing to get his hands dirty. It's very heavily implied that he was a not so good person once upon a time, very likely a criminal, maybe even a henchman for a crime boss or 4. He'd since moved on with his life and tried to set himself on the straight and narrow, getting married and raising a son, but his past caught up with him. One day someone comes along, someone who he likely had no history with, we never really get to know, but they break into his home and hold his wife and son hostage until Wilt returns home. He's immediately beaten and pistol whipped with a shotgun and tied down to a chair, being forced to watch his intruder. And I'm going to go ahead and preface this by saying that, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very harsh origin story. So if you are squeamish or you are very, and I'm not using this term lightly, but if you are easily triggered, I highly advise maybe you skip ahead a minute. All right, I'm giving you an opportunity. I want to give everybody a fair chance because I'm not going to lie, this was actually a very difficult video for me to do, and I was very kind of on the fence about doing this one, but we're doing it. I'm giving you time to walk away or skip ahead, and now we can talk about this origin. Getting back to brass tacks, Wilt is tied down to a chair and forced to watch his intruder rape his wife and sodomize his son. All he can do is simply watch as they cry for his help. And eventually, this intruder kills both of them execution style before moving on to sodomize Wilt as well, and when he's done with him, shoot him in the back of the head. Unfortunately for his attacker, Wilt survived all of that. And by his own admission, 4 months in the hospital, 18 months in physical therapy, and maybe 10 minutes worth of mourning later, he realized Wilt was dead the day he watched his family be raped and murdered. Deathwish was born. And from that moment forward, Deathwish spent 2 years tracking down the man who took everything from him, and when he found him, he ended him. And since then, he spent the rest of his time in the Milestone Comics Dakotaverse, specifically hunting down and torturing and killing any and all sex offenders and sex criminals. And I'm gonna go ahead and tell you right now, I'm not making light of this, but this guy would be in hog heaven during the Me Too era. Trust me on that. It's probably obvious by this point, Deathwish has no superpowers, but he more than makes up for it with raw strength and indomitable spirit. He's highly skilled with military-grade firearms, holding his own against even hardware in a firefight. He's in peak physical condition and built like a brick house. He was able to go toe-to-toe with hardware in hand-to-hand combat, able to put paws on Hardware, who, mind you, is wearing a high-tech nanomachine exoskeleton on par in the 90s with anything Iron Man is wearing today. And Deathwish was able to bare-knuckle brawl him and actually hurt him. He even displayed proficiency in martial arts techniques. Not only that, but he was fast enough to dodge traps and weaponry from Hardware's Omni Cannon. He's also able to take power armored shots from Hardware, and mind you, Hardware is a guy who's been able to keep pace with other Dakotaverse characters like Holocaust and Icon. Deathwish is unique in terms of vigilantes in comics in that he's incredibly honorable. Even if he doesn't necessarily, quotey fingers, fight fair, he oftentimes will offer his enemy, doesn't matter if they're a run-of-the-mill criminal or a superpowered hero, he will gift them a weapon to use against him. Whether it's a gun or a knife, doesn't matter. And if they refuse the weapon, he'll choose not to use a weapon either and just throw hands instead. This character was also honorable in that during his creation and first appearance in Hardware number 5, he was hunting down a serial killer who was raping women, all of which were prostitutes, and killing them. Hardware was also tracking down the same killer, but all roads led him to Deathwish. And at first, it seemed like a "we happened to be in the same place at the same time" style of superhero misunderstanding, but we later learned Deathwish is, in fact, the killer. Only Deathwish didn't know it. The trauma of surviving the rape and murder of his family fractured his mind so terribly and caused him to have blackouts. He was the one who was actually perpetrating the sex crimes. He was actually looking for himself, and during these blackout periods is when he would commit these horrible sex crimes. Now, once Hardware discovers the truth and hits him with the reality of it, Deathwish remembers everything and admits to the crimes and willingly lets the police take him into custody and sentence him to prison. Something you don't typically see in characters like this. Now, I'm gonna kind of jump off on a tangent here, unlike some of the other character breakdown videos that I do, because this character is kind of all over the place. He's had this really interesting history, and I think some of the things that are really interesting about him are some of the things that don't have to do with him and his comic, but more the time he was created and how far ahead of his time he was, and some of the behind the scenes stuff that was going on with the character. And one of the most interesting things to me about him is his solo miniseries that was released a year later in 1994, a series that was spearheaded by the late Maddie Blaustein. Now, does the name Maddie Blaustein sound familiar to you? It should if you are a fan of Pokemon. She was a trans writer who also worked as a voice actor, primarily with 4Kids Entertainment, voicing characters like Meowth from the first episode of Pokemon up until the time of her death in 2008. She also did voices for various anime and video games like One Piece, Slayers, Ultimate Muscle, Samurai Deeper Kyo, Valkyrie Profile, Yu-Gi-Oh!, G.I. Joe Sigma 6, among other things. And as a trans writer, Maddie introduced a narrative to Milestone media you didn't often see in Deathwish's comic. She introduced one of, if not the first, openly trans superhero in mainstream comics in the form of Lieutenant Marissa Rom, a police officer who eventually works alongside Deathwish due to him wanting someone to take up his crusade against sex criminals in case he snaps again and repeats his past mistakes. That said, this kind of takes us back to another interesting thing about Deathwish, just the fact that Deathwish was able to see Marissa, who was at the time Lieutenant Leon Martin Rom, for who they truly were, even when they weren't aware of it themselves, telling them they were, quotey fingers, one of the girls, after only talking with them for a handful of panels. Now, more importantly, this is a Deathwish video, so I don't want to get too far off into the Marissa Rom, weeds. Maybe I'll do a video on her at a later date, but I will say this last thing, that this same series where Rom is introduced is also what led to Deathwish breaking out of prison, a feat he's successfully pulled off twice in both his own series and Hardware's, making him a rather accomplished escapologist. Despite feeling guilty for his own sex crimes, he still wanted to stop the rapists and murderers he left out on the streets. That said, there's not really a whole heap of a lot else to Deathwish. I think his comic was actually the most interesting thing about him, and kind of the vibe surrounding it and the time that it came out just made it very interesting. There weren't a lot of comics like that out. I mean, yeah, at the time, Image Comics was coming out as well, and they had some pretty entertaining and extreme comics, but I felt like Deathwish actually tackled issues that even Image was afraid to touch back then, and that's saying something, considering that I just did a video about one of their superheroes who was kidnapped and forcefully injected with AIDS and became a superhero. I mean, let's be real here, people. But that said, I think Deathwish is an interesting character who doesn't get a lot of love, and that's why I decided to talk about him. Now, normally in these videos, I talk about an actor who I would love to see play this character if, for whatever reason, they wound up on the big or small screen. And the guy who came to mind was actually an actor by the name of Liam McIntyre. Some of you may or may not know him. I was introduced to him through the show Spartacus, which was, and still technically is, one of my favorite TV shows of all time. Yeah, it was a little grimy, yeah, it was a little sex-laden, but honestly, I was here for it. Liam McIntyre is good at playing characters who are conflicted, characters who may be your protagonist, but may also be somebody that you shouldn't like. He doesn't necessarily have the greatest body of work when it comes to acting, but I really enjoyed him as the voice of Captain Boomerang in Suicide Squad Hell to Pay. Not only that, but aside from Spartacus, he does a really amazing job as the Weather Wizard on the CW The Flash TV show. And those of you who are Gears of War fans, you'll probably recognize Miss JD Phoenix from Gears of War 4 and 5. But anyways, regardless of whether you knew who Deathwish was before this video or you're just now finding out about him, let me know what you think about the character. Sound off in the comments.
So hey, you made it to the end of the video. Awesome for you. If you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, I don't see how you didn't, do me a favor. Hulk smash that like button. And if you want to see more awesome videos like this one, make sure you click subscribe so you can become one of Earth's mightiest subscribers. And tap that bell so you know when I post up. Also, feel free to go check out my Patreon, where if you chuck in $1, you can get early access to most of my videos up to a week early. And if you have time, make sure you swing by nerd901.com, where you can find more of my content as well as other amazing stuff. Anyways, until next time, I love you 3000 plus ultra!